Recently, I was in need of a HTTP client for C++, and one of the top results I found was CPR. Now, this library has 6,000 stars on GitHub, so I thought that should be pretty good. And whenever I add a dependency to my C++ projects, I always like to do my due diligence, because C++ is full of foot guns and it's easy to just write bad code. And as I was looking through the source code, as you can see, I have looked through quite a bit of the source code. I was not pleased with what I saw. In fact, I would say this is a pretty poorly written library, entirely because of a few design decisions. So I thought I would make this video series that tries to go over different dependencies and explores why they might be not ideal to use. But yeah, this library is still perfectly usable. It does its job okay. This isn't a fresh build, but this library does take quite some time to build, and that's one of the reasons why it might be a bad dependency. This library is just a curl wrapper, and a lot of the issues actually come from how it wraps them. Okay, so let's take a look. First, we take a look at the humble get request. Now, of course, the first parameter is usually a URL to what you want to send the get request to, and you see that it has a URL class. Okay, interesting. My first thought when I saw this was, this obviously must be a URL parser. A lot of languages have this. I think C# has one built in, and even C++ has one, as the file system path is essentially a URL parser. I was assuming that this was splitting it into different parts and all that good stuff. When I took a look, I was not quite pleased with what I saw. When you take a look at this class doesn't do anything. As you can see, URL is a subclass of string holder. As you can see, it's using the curiously recurring template pattern. So all the heavy lifting must be done by string holder, but it seems a bit ridiculous. You go over to string holder in the same file, and it is just an std string wrapper. What's the point of an std string wrapper? Who knows? Why not just expose std string directly? This is the kind of code you write when you're paid by the lines of code. But no, they're not being paid, so I don't know what they're doing. Yeah, this is quite strange. As you can see, the curiously recurring template parenting is being used for the return type of the operator overloads. But yeah, this is quite useless. And yeah, you might be looking at this and be like, why would anyone do this? Well, there actually is a reason. Let's go back to main CPP. I took this example from their GitHub page and just slightly modified it to output the text. This is like some dead code, that's fine. Now if you take a look at get's signature, it actually uses a parameter pack. These are not set parameters. Okay, let's take a look. Okay, it does a little expansion to set options, and yeah, you kind of have to go through like a whole rabbit hole to find what the code actually does. And as you can see, this does a parameter pack expansion. I'm not sure if you would call this a full expression, but yeah, whatever. And the first overload, for each type, it's calling this function, and this in turn, oh man, all these misdirection. That's not great for readability. Anyway, it calls set option. As you can see, set option has a lot of overloads. The first one being URL. So the way this works is, these types actually work as a tag, right? And then it knows which one of the overloads to call. Now, on the surface, this might seem quite clever and very smart, even some would say elegant. I disagree. This is overcomplicated for the sake of being overcomplicated. One of the biggest issues this causes, aside from very slow compile times, which, yeah, this is just a curl wrapper, and on a fresh build, it can take some time to compile. This also creates a lot of code bloat, not in terms of boilerplate, but in terms of the actual for every arrangement of parameters, this gets copy pasted. Now, granted, the functions are quite small and it won't actually result in that much code bloat. That's not even my biggest concern. The thing is, what would be better here is all HTTP requests should just take an option struct. Should just be a plain old data struct that contains all of the yeah, options you need, like the URL, the basic auth stuff, headers, anything like that. It will be implemented something like this. Now, this is a pretty basic example. Obviously, you would have many more fields, but yeah, this is just to show you how it would work. And also, I use a string view instead of a C string. For most use cases, you probably wouldn't want to pass a C string like this. This makes the allocation when there probably isn't a need to do the allocation. Like you're just adding some unnecessary overhead. I think a good wrapper should minimize overhead as much as possible, and this does not do that. This actually adds quite a bit of overhead. And yeah, all of your other fields would just be here. And if you did this, you created the options struct, like every library does. This entire file would not have any reason to exist. This useless SD string wrapper just would not exist. More so than that, you eliminate even more source code. Like, let's take a look at here. Look at all of these functions just to set options. All of these would just disappear, go up in smoke. But the thing is, this is not the only use of string holder. No. Which also I find quite strange that URL is in the CPR types. It seems like it should be in its own file, but whatever. That's just nitpicking, doesn't matter that much. If you take a look at the body class, it's also a subclass of string holder. And as you can see, the entire class is practically useless. Except for this one constructor. We'll get back to this in a second. And yeah, as you can see, most of these files, in fact I would say 90% of these files are just for the options. Now some of these would still be necessary even with the option struct, but a pretty good majority of them would just disappear. Because except encoding, that options struct could just have this unordered set instead of this fairly useless class. And that's pretty much true for most of the files here. This one singular bad design decision cascaded down to an enormous amount of boilerplate. Again, this is a curl wrapper, but it is 5,000 lines of code. I have written 2 different HTTP clients in the past, one in C#, one in Odin, using TCP sockets. And both of those times, they were significantly smaller than 5,000 lines of code. But this is just the wrapper. I wrote those from scratch, and even a wrapper is massively bigger. This boilerplate is just completely unnecessary. This results in very slow compile times. There's lots of overhead that shouldn't exist. It will cause a lot of code bloat. This is quite literally a bad dependency.
He said it!
Now this is like one design decision, and it's probably the biggest and most this is the biggest and worst design decision in this library, but there are still a few other things that I want to take a look at. Now getting back to the body class, it takes a file as its first parameter of the constructor. That's interesting, a file class, but hey, why is it loading up the file itself? Right, that doesn't really make sense. If you have a file class, shouldn't the file be responsible for that? So the thing is, you have a path class that just represents a path in a file system, right? A path class shouldn't be responsible for loading a file, but a file class is responsible for loading a file. If that's not responsible for loading a file, I don't know what is. So let's take a look at a file. And oh my, what do we have here? It's just a C string and an overridden file name field. I don't know what this does, probably useless. Yeah, what would have been wrong with just taking a C string here? This code is written like it's self-important. It's masturbatory. This class is useless. It has no reason to exist. It goes along with the trend of useless boilerplate. And right below that we have files, which again is just another useless wrapper. It's just an SD vector wrapper. It doesn't actually do anything useful. And the thing is, I actually quite like encapsulation. I think encapsulation is a great thing when used properly. This is not a good use of encapsulation. There's no reason for this to be private. You don't need any like controlled access, and it would eliminate all of this boilerplate. I do not understand these design decisions. No programmer makes a design decision without some sort of logic. And I'm sure they have some reasoning for doing this, but I just cannot comprehend it. Maybe I'm just too stupid. But more so than these like weird design decisions, there's some other issues as well. Mainly with the styling. Now, I'm not criticizing this style for being bad. I have a completely different style, but any style is valid as long as it's consistent. The problem is it's not consistent. Look at this little enum class for accept encodings. It's all lowercase, fair enough, you do you. Going to errors.h, another enum class, but this time it uses upper snake case. Why? I don't know. It is completely inconsistent. There is no logic behind this. And furthermore, let's go to thread pool. Thread pool also has a little enum here, but this time it's not an enum class. That's an interesting decision. Now, maybe they did it because they don't want to use the namespace. That's fair enough, I understand. But you're still using the namespace. But it actually gets worse than that. They don't always use the namespace. Let's take a look at here. Over here, not using the namespace. Not using the namespace. But then, using the namespace. This is quite frankly deranged. I don't understand why that's so inconsistent. But it doesn't end there. Look at this methods field. It is a private field, so it has a special naming convention. It uses a suffix, strange but alright. If you go back to the file.h class, you have another private field, no special naming convention. Why? I quite frankly don't know. And again, you have a global variable, and this uses Pascal case. Fair enough. Go back to errors.h. We have another global variable, and it uses snake case. Again, very inconsistent. And quite frankly, I don't understand why it's so inconsistent. Like, clearly several people are working on this, and they don't have a set coding style, and they don't seem to like each other very much, because they don't seem to have any respect for each other's coding styles, which is ridiculous. Aside from that, getting back to this table, I personally don't like doing the table like this. Instead of a table, they could just use a simple function with a switch statement, and that would return a std string view. Yeah, that would eliminate a global variable. I don't think global variables are bad, not at all. They can be good if they're used correctly. But why have more global variables than you need? Even the accept encoding class, again, has no reason to exist. This little constructor that takes the enum class and converts it to this string could quite literally just be a loose function, and yeah, there you go. So this is just overall, everything in this file is just poorly designed. Now, this was a bit of a nitpick. Despite like how inconsistent the styling is and some of the bad design decisions here, it shouldn't actually affect the usability of the library, unlike the stuff we covered before. Like, it doesn't necessarily make it bad dependencies, but it's still an issue I have with the library. Taking a look at async, you see they have a global thread pool, and it inherits from thread pool. Now, I don't know why you would ever want to generalize a thread pool, because why would you want to have multiple instances of a thread pool? But, maybe there's a good reason. But in this code base, as far as I can tell, this is the only place thread pool is used, so this generalization is generally useless. But they use singletons here. Now, this is a bit more subjective. I personally don't like singletons. You could just do this procedurally, just have a bunch of functions and keep all of your states as globals in a CPP file. That's one way of doing it. I personally just don't like singletons at all. But it's subjective. Some people could tell you they're good. You know what? Take that as you will. One thing that kind of bothers, like this async function here is responsible for submitting jobs to the thread pool. Okay, fair enough. But why do you have a class also named async? Yeah, that's disgusting. I don't like that. There's probably a good reason for this, but there's probably lots of better ways to do this. I don't like this one bit.